and we're going to look at verse 16. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 16. All right. He says,
I do have one, but I sure don't want you to address it today because it's going to take you a long time.
okay, what is it?
There's so many different times in the Bible that refers to Zion.
Okay.
And, you know, I understand that, you know, Zion is the presence of God in some, but if you would do that some other day, because I know it's going to take a long time.
Okay.
There's so many different references to Zion, and sometimes they sure aren't the same as what I understand as, you know, in some scriptures, the presence of God.
Right.
So would you consider doing that sometime?
Sure.
Certainly not today.
Okay.
It's going to take too long.
Well, just to give you to let you know, Mount Zion is it's a hill in Jerusalem, and it's where the Temple Mount is located. So it's just where the temple is. So when they say we're going up to Mount Zion, they're saying we're going up to worship. We're going up to the temple.
Sometimes it just says Zion.
Right.
And what was I reading yesterday that referred to, it was in Isaiah.
Yes.
And it referred to, I don't know where
Mount.
it is now.
Mount Zion is mentioned in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4,
Well,
about...
It could be my NIV because it didn't say Mount Zion.
Well, it might not say Mount. It might just say Zion. Because that's what it'd be like us saying, well, that wouldn't make any sense to you because there's not any mountains in Florida. I might say let's go to Cheehaw, and Cheehaw is the tallest mountain in Alabama. A lot of people don't call it Mount Cheehaw. They just call it Cheehaw. Let's go to Cheehaw. And everybody knows that's the largest mountain in, you know, so in the scripture when they say let's go up to Zion, they're saying let's go travel up to Mount Zion. So
Which chapter? See, I counted 2 and 3.
That's right.
That's one of them.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just make this comment for Jimmy's benefit. I think that
Sure.
Mount Zion is a physical location, but like so many applications that we have in Scripture, there's a spiritual sense, and that's what you have in Hebrews 12:24.
Right.
We are come to Mount Zion. You and I, as Christians, we are come to Mount Zion, the presence of God.
That's right.
Yeah, so it has its physical and its spiritual comport as well.
That's right. Zelda, did you have something?
No, I was just saying it's just figurative, I guess, for a holy place.
Right. That's what it becomes.
Yeah.
That's what it becomes.
Yeah, that's the same thing. It's just you figured it, from my understanding, that it's really not a mountain. It's just where the temple was, and it's not really a mountain there.
Well, that is what they call the Temple Mount. So that's what they call Mount Zion. It becomes a figurative reference to the presence of God, as we see in Hebrews 12.
Right.
But in Isaiah 2:3, he says, many people will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So it's just a reference to the holy city of God, Jerusalem, where the temple is, that sort of thing. But we'll do a full study on it later, like you said, like you asked, Jimmy.
Oh, that's good.
All right.
I just read more into it than I should have.
No. Good question. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 16. Okay. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. All right. I have a question for you. Who was the second president of the U.S.? All right. So we have John Adams. Now, first president, George Washington. Okay. Who was the first king to reign in Jerusalem? Saul didn't reign in Jerusalem. So it was David. Lonnie?
First king that I know of was, what's called, why the name just slipped my mind?
Saul?
No. You mean after they left, what's called? I'm talking about the king before then.
Oh, right, the
There
king.
was a king of Salem. What was his name? Melchizedek.
Melchizedek, right.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm talking about
Just the priest.
over,
After they left, what's called?
right, I'm talking about kings of Israel over Jerusalem, over the nation of Israel. So the first one was David, because Saul wasn't from Jerusalem, didn't reign in Jerusalem. The second one is Solomon, okay? Now, if John Adams, if he said, I'm more wise and more knowledgeable than all of the presidents that came before me, what kind of saying is that?
It's better to be first one.
Right. All right. Now, read this again then. Behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. So if David was the first one to reign from Jerusalem, then who was the second one to reign over Jerusalem? It'd be Solomon. All right, so what's going on in verse 16 of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 then?
He said he was better than his dad.
Possibly.
What book are you reading from?
It could-
What book of you? What version is this?
New American Standard.
Oh, look, why you changed the whole book?
No, that's the version I've used since I got here. It's the version.
I thought you used the NIV, and I thought the NIV this morning.
No, that's Jimmy. Jimmy uses NIV.
Oh, you use American Standard?
I've used the one that's in the pew the whole time ever since I got here.
I brought the NIV this morning. I thought you used the NIV.
Let's see, they're all over the place. Is this one? Y'all got New American Standards out your ears.
Okay, 19 what? 11?
No, the New American Standard was published once in the 70s and revised again in
Oh, they-
the 90s, I think.
7? That's pretty.
Well, American Standard was
They had one before then.
the American Standard was published in like 1906 or something like that.
Oh, 11, okay.
But the New American Standard was published in the 70s and then republished again 20 years later, I think is what it was, in the 90s.
Okay, then, okay. That's bad.
Well, let me go to the NIV and let's see what's going there.
No, I bring American Standard.
Well, I'm curious now, so let's see. Ecclesiastes 1:16.
Yeah, I have just about the same.
I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much wisdom and knowledge. So about the same, close to the same thing. So we would think that if John Adams stood up when he got elected, he had his inauguration or whatever, has his hand on the Bible, does all that, and then he says, I'm more wise than all the presidents that came before me. We would go, don't you mean president, not presidents, right? We would be confused by that statement. Here, we read that he is more wise than all who are over Jerusalem before him, which would be, David, right?
The way he worded that, though, was there anybody else that would be considered a ruler over Israel before king started?
Well, over Israel, the judges maybe, but this is specifically over Jerusalem. So I was just going to show you this verse. We're gonna cover it probably next week. I really just want to cover verses 1 through 11 today, but I just wanted to show you this verse to get you thinking, because the authorship of Ecclesiastes is under much debate. Has been under much debate since back in ancient times. Even the Jews debated about it. And if you look at verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, the assumption that you make immediately is, that's talking about Solomon. But then when you read verse 16, you go, that's kind of weird for Solomon to say, because there was only two, him and his father, that reigned over Jerusalem. So I wanted to introduce that to you, just so you would have, some healthy speculation about who wrote the book. It's not going to impact the interpretations of the book. It's not going to impact, how we go on certain passages. Just wanted to throw that out there to you to make you go, never thought about that. All right. Johnny, did you have something?
Yeah, you said something to think about when we Solomon, and God promised that he'd give him anything that he wanted, riches and all of this, but that all he wanted was from God, but he wanted wisdom to be able to lead his people.
Yep, that's true. That's right. And he was so wise that people came from all over just to behold his wisdom.
So it may be a reason he could make a statement.
Right, and next week we're going to get into it a little bit. There's a passage in the Chronicles that's similar to that one about Solomon that we're going to go to next week. But I just wanted to throw that out there to you so that you'd think about it, and have just some, healthy speculation about the book. Again, the authorship of the book of Ecclesiastes and the time that it was written doesn't really play that big of a deal into the interpretation of the book itself. It's kind of like when you're studying the book of Revelation. Well, the timing and the authorship of that book, well, that kind of does matter. But when you read like the book of Matthew never says, hey, this was Matthew writing in AD 60, 50, 40, whatever, and I wrote from the town of Jerusalem, right? Never says that. And there is no name attached to the book of Matthew other than what's been handed down through church history. And so having a big debate over who authored the book of Matthew doesn't really help you at all, because it doesn't, add anything or take away anything from the book other than, wow, those people that put that in there as said that Matthew wrote that, well, they were pretty smart. That's all that you can really get when you come away from that. Same with some other books of the Old Testament, like 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, all these others. You can debate about who wrote it and when it was written, but that doesn't change the message that's in the book at all. That doesn't have any effect. And so what I just wanted to show you is that if Solomon wrote this book, or if a descendant of David wrote this book and is writing, as a descendant or as a son of David, like children of Abraham or sons of Abraham or daughters of Abraham, then, it's not going to change how you read the book. All it's going to make you say is, oh, okay, this is Solomon, or oh, okay, this is whomever. We'll get into that a little bit next week when we get down to verse 12 and following. But I just wanted to introduce you to that debate that's ongoing, and that's never going. By the way, it's never going to be solved, because we don't have that type of ability. But I'm just going to throw that out there to you so you'll think about it over the next week. All right. For our class, for our purposes, we're just going to say it's Solomon, because that's just what we're going to do until we get to verse 12. That being said, verses 1 through 11 are written by a narrator. So what you have, the book of Ecclesiastes is laid out like this. You have a prologue, verses 1 through 11, in which the preacher is talked about in the third person. And then you have from verse 12 of chapter 1 all the way down to verse... I have this written down. What am I doing? From verse 12 of chapter 1 all the way down. Come on now. Click. To verse 7 of chapter 12, you have the words of the preacher. And then from verse 8 of chapter 12 all the way down to verse 14, in chapter 12, you have the narrator coming back to give sort of a conclusion to the book. So you have prologue, verses 1 through 11, the words of the preacher, 12 through the end of the book, chapter 12, verse 7, and then the rest of the book is the narrator again, giving the conclusion to the preacher's words. All right? So here we go. Jimmy.
The NIV, and I don't know what your New American Standard or King James says, but chapter 1, verse 1, it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, and then has a colon, and like those are his words.
Oh, yes. So the narrator quotes the preacher in verse 2, and then again when he comes back into the discussion in chapter 12 and verse 8. But you'll see what I mean when we get down here. In verse 12 he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. He talks about the preacher in third person, though, in chapter 1 and verse 1.
What was that phrase again? In over Jerusalem?
I, the preacher, have been king.
Have been?
Yes.
Okay.
So he's going to quote the preacher in verse 2. Notice it's in quotation marks. And then it goes back to narration in verses 3 all the way down to verse 11. And then it returns to the preacher in verse 12. So he's just putting a quotation. And verses 1 through 11, this prologue to the book, are really going to be a summary and a quick explanation of the book before the preacher actually gives his voice. So you might call him the preacher. I think Jimmy said his version said, what was it? Was it teacher? Is that right? And I think some people just transliterate the Hebrew there and call him Koleth or Colette. Is that what, whose does?
That's what mine says.
That's what yours says? Okay. So there's different ways that they translate this word, preacher, teacher. It's just one who's teaching. That's all we have to worry about.
One that have wisdom with it. Yeah, this is teacher.
Right. That's right.
Just the one who's claiming something.
That's right. One who's making a proclamation. So the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Then he says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does the new NIV say there, Lonnie?
That's what it's saying there.
Vanity of vanities. What about yours, Jimmy? Does yours say vanity of vanities as well?
Meaningless.
Meaningless. That's right.
Verse 2?
That's right.
Meaningless.
There's different versions of the NIV too there, Lonnie.
There must be a newer one. He must have a newer one.
No, you've got the newer one.
I thought I did.
Right, because it says meaningless.
I don't know what year it was. I didn't look to see what year.
Yeah, well,
I got one of the older ones, and it's quite a bit different.
the NIV made a lot of people mad in certain places, so they had to retranslate it several years later to...
Well, I get that. Like 1 John, they say it was wrote in 80, 90. Come on now.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that's out. But it's a seventh grading reading someone. I can do it.
Very good. All right, so vanity, you could say meaningless. One version that I saw said absurdity. So it's just the idea of, you know, what is this all worth? Well, it's worth nothing. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. You know, there's no point. That's kind of the attitude of chapter 1 and verse 2. Vanity of vanity, saith the preacher. Meaningless, it's meaningless, it's meaningless. It's absurd, it's absurd. One thing you can say, everything is absolutely, I said, absolutely absurd. So that's kind of how one commentator put it. You can even do that in Foghorn Leghorn's voice. I said it's absurd, you know, or whatever he does there. But the point is, nothing's worth anything, is what he says. All is vanity. All is absurd. He said, what advantage does man have in all his work, or you could say labor, which he does under the sun? The word advantage there is could be translated surplus or payoff. What use is it? What worth is it? What's the point to it? Let's see. What payoff is there in any activity I could possibly engage in throughout the land of the living, is what he's basically asking. The word work there isn't necessarily like you go to work 9 to 5. The word work there is activity. That could be your relationships that you have, hobbies that you have, instruments that you try to learn how to play, TV shows you're trying to binge watch, you know, any sort of that stuff that you like to do or want to do, or even, you know, eating and drinking and whatever. He says, what advantage does man have in all his work, all his activity that he does on this earth? Well, none. It's just useless. It's vain. It's absurd. It's worthless, meaningless. And the reason why, as we're going to see, this is sort of his reason why throughout the whole book, is that every single person dies.
Right.
And everything virtually stays, you know, basically the same. Now, this isn't necessarily heaven versus earth. This isn't not necessarily him saying everything the man does under the sun is meaningless because he's not heavenly focused. That's not necessarily what he's saying, as we're going to see when we get down. He's just simply trying to say, now keep in mind, he's a poet. He's trying to make a point through exaggeration, and he's saying that everything that we do here is just, it seems to be meaningless. is his point. And why? Because it all ends in death. Here's what he says in verse 4. A generation goes and a generation comes. What you got, Lonnie? Well, is everything that you do actually meaningless? Do you not find meaning in family and in Thanksgiving dinners and praying at night and in, talking to your friends and singing and playing music and stuff like that, at your house, all that kind of stuff? Oh, right. So he is being a negative Nancy, as you might say. Sorry to any Nancys that might be. But
He just being sarcastic, right?
yeah, he has tried to live by the book of Proverbs, and it hasn't worked out for him very much. He raised his child in the way they should go, but he departed anyway, that kind of stuff. Because the Proverbs aren't strict rules. Here, if you do this, you're definitely going to get this. They're general principles of how to live a fulfilling life. So he has, he's tried out the book of Proverbs. He's been burned. He can't, nothing seems to be working for him because, well, we'll get to that in a little bit. So he says a generation goes and a generation comes. That's kind of backwards from what we would say, right? We would say a generation comes and a generation goes. What he's saying is this generation goes before this generation even comes. So there's no memory of this previous generation, in other words. In other words, we're all going to live and we're all going to die and we're all going to be forgotten and nobody's going to remember anything that we've done. And so what's the point of it all anyway? That's what the writers, that's what he's trying to get across. And so let's see. Basically, death is the end of everything. He's going to prove this by looking at 3 examples of fruitless labor. He's going to look at the sun, he's going to look at the wind, and he's going to look at the rivers pouring into the ocean. All right? And he's going to follow that up with 3 other examples of fruitless labor. Humans speaking, humans seeing, and humans hearing, as we're going to see here in a second. So he says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. So what's it accomplish? It just goes up and it goes down, and the same thing every day, all day long, 24/7, 365. Just goes up and down. Well, in certain parts of the world, and some days it's dark for days and days and days before it's light again because of how, high up they are.
That's what we was talking about this morning coming to church.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You come so fast. She said, Mama was saying that she don't get any sleep at night, and when day comes, it goes so fast. It's
Right.
trying to go right back to sleep.
Well, that's what he's saying. He's saying it rises and it comes, and what's the point of it all? Here we go, All right. Then he says in verse 6, blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north, the wind continues just swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. What's it done? It's just come right back to where it was. A generation goes, and a generation comes, and a generation goes, and it comes, and nothing's really different. Everything's the same, right? Then he says in verse 7, all the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. So it's like filling up a bathtub that never gets high enough, You're just going, what's the point of this? And that's what the author's saying here, is that all of everything is absurd, it's meaningless, here, and I'll prove to you the absurdity of our life through nature itself. What does it accomplish? It's just going and coming and going. Now, we know that the sun rising and setting, it's not really doing that on its own. The sun's just out there, right? And we're rotating around it as we spin, and so that's not really meaningless. It's giving nutrients to the crops to do it's giving vitamin D to the light to the crops to do photosynthesis. It lets us get nice and tan during the summer. It is the reason why all the snowbirds come to Florida in the winter, and not stay where they live, just because, that's what the sun's doing. So it's not meaningless, right? But his point is, in the grand scheme of things, what's it really accomplishing? Nothing's really different. This is his pessimistic attitude that he takes, an attitude that we've all had, and that we probably will have some other time too. And we know that the reason why the rivers flow into the sea and it never gets full because of the water cycle, evaporation, and then rain, and then goes back into the ocean, right? So we understand these things from a scientific point of view, but he's not making a scientific point here in like actual, what is being accomplished, is work, is energy being transformed, is work transferred, is work being done. And he's just saying, what's different? Nothing's different. All the things are the same. Nothing's progressing. That's what he's upset about. So then he says in verse 8, all things are wearisome, and man is not able to tell about it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing it, nor is the ear filled with hearing. So you can talk about it and never, reach a conclusion. You can look at it and never be fully satisfied. You can listen and never be filled with hearing. Again, it's just meaningless. It's fruitless. On and on and on you could go and never be done. That which has been is that which will be. That which has been, he says, or that which has been done is that which will be done. So there is nothing new under the sun. Now, your immediate reaction when you're reading this is going, well, wait a minute, we got cell phones today. We didn't have cell phones, 50 years ago. We had phones, but not cell phones. And they didn't have phones 100 years before that. And we've got, color TV, and they didn't have color TV in Solomon's day, so there's something new, right? Well, he anticipates that in verse 10. After all, he's the wisest person who's ever lived, so he beats you to it. He says, is there anything of which one might say, see, this is new? Already it has existed for ages, which were before us. So what he's saying is inventions and absurdities don't take away, rather inventions and discoveries don't take away from the absurdity of life. We got cell phones, but what has that done? That's just added to the trouble, right? It makes things worse, Now you got people nagging you, and you got, he's got all these messages you got to return he's talking about, and, people are upset and gossiping and bickering all the time, and they can't just focus on, so everything, as you go on, everything, it's all just worse, is what his argument is. Lonnie and then Zelda.
Okay. This person that wrote it,
right,
evidently got some age on at this time to be able to be saying anything.
Right.
Because I think about myself. I remember when they had vinyl, the records and that.
Right.
Then they come with the VCR. What do you call it?
CDs?
No, the other thing. No. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Wait a minute. No, they had the little like cassette tape put in.
Oh, right.
Track, they used to call it.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Then they come up with the cassette, put in the little recorder.
Right.
Now they come out with other DVDs and all this other stuff, and now they reverting back to vinyl.
Oh,
and a lot of people don't see that. They going back to vinyl. People won't vinyl now.
Well, they want it for the aesthetic of it all,
Okay. You've been watching TV too much.
Well, yeah, I guess so.
But a lot of people are reverting back to that now.
Yep.
They got record players out, but not as good as they used to make.
And thus, there's nothing new in the sun. So, Zelda, what were?
When it all boils down, it basically comes from communication. Communication is always some type of way of communicating. As we change through life, there's different ways of communication. Just like Lonnie was just saying, they went from records to tapes, the little tapes to put in there, and then now you got the CDs, the DVDs. Now we got the cell phones.
Yeah, I was about to say, who even uses CDs anymore?
Watches, the watches.
Everybody
now.
uses, right?
It's continuous, some kind of communication.
Right. That's right. So he's saying while inventions have come and discoveries have come, the essence of life, hasn't really changed. Okay, sure we got chariots now, but not really different. Same war, same fighting, same stuff. It's all absurd. Donna, did you have something?
I see the bottom line in all of this writer's intent is man does whatever they can to find happiness, and it's all useless without God.
Yep, that's right. Now your spoiler alert there. No, but that's right. That's right, Donna. That's the conclusion that is made at the end of the book.
Right.
Is really life finds its meaning in enjoying life in the moment and following God. Gary?
From the beginning, every generation thinks they're smarter than the prior generation or generations. But the point is that I see Solomon, by inspired wisdom, is saying, we'll be inventing for as long as we blow ourselves up. But there's nothing invented that didn't come from what is already here.
Right.
I'm not going to talk about the genius of Alexander Graham Bell or Steve Jobs. It doesn't make a difference. All of their genius incorporated stuff that was already here.
Right.
And that's where there's nothing new under the sun. There never will be anything invented that, people think they're going to walk on Mars and create a society on the moon. Anything that can be done will be done with what's already available.
Right. I want to go to the moon. They got good cheese there.
Oh, I heard that when I was a kid.
Yeah, but that's right. That's right, Gary. We have a limited number of elements, and then some elements that have been made from other elements, and no new elements. Right? It's just going to be the same old HHELIBEBCNOFNE, all the way down. So I don't know what those mean. I just memorized the letters to impress the teacher, and got through 2 lines and said, "Never mind, this is dumb," and stopped doing it. But I'll always remember those 2 lines. But anyways, that's it. Most of it's carbon, right? So then he says in verse 10 again, "Is there anything of which one might say, 'See, this is new'? Already it has existed for ages which were before us. There is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still." So again, he's talking about death. Death is the end of everything, is what he's saying. So anything that you do is ultimately meaningless because you're going to die, and what's it going to matter then? Because later generations are going to forget it. Now, of course, this is very pessimistic. Let me show you a couple verses. Proverbs 10 and verse 7. He says, "The memory of the righteous is blessed, but the name of the wicked will rot." In other words, the righteous individuals would be remembered. Psalm 112 and verse 6, "For he will never be shaken. The righteous will be remembered forever." So Ecclesiastes 1 verse 11 is a very sort of a pessimistic view. This is talking about things that man does, as Donna and Gary had pointed out and others. These are things that man does to find joy here with himself or for himself, apart from God, mostly. So there is no remembrance of earlier things. Let's see. In Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 16, he says, "For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool. Inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die." So that's kind of a different message than what was given in Proverbs and Psalms. But he's not talking in wooden literal language. Neither is, Proverbs or Psalms, by the way. Because how many righteous men have been forgotten? We don't know the names of every righteous man that's ever lived. How many wise people have been forgotten from our standpoint? Okay, yeah, but they've all been remembered by God, right? And that's where we're going to find the meaning, is life has meaning because of God and because of the relationships that we have with each other and things like that. And so he says there is no remembrance of earlier things. Everybody's going to die. Righteous people are going to die. Wicked people are going to die. Wise people, foolish people, people that just don't care. Everybody's going to die. So basically his question is, what's the point? And the experiment that Solomon performs from chapter 1 and verse 12 through chapter 12 and verse 7 is going to different areas of life. He's going to try out sexual relationships. He's going to try out money. He's going to try out trying to get more wisdom, trying to learn more. He's going to try out royalty, being a king, and all this sort of stuff, being a ruler, and try out all these different things to see what is it that gives life meaning. And the conclusion to the whole thing is, well, nothing gives life meaning besides God, is what he's going to end up saying. Lonnie?
I was going to make a comment. When I was small, they said genius is one step from being a fool. So Solomon, going out with his wisdom, he wound up doing foolishness.
The book of Ecclesiastes could probably be summed up by James 4:13 and following. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." So James 4:13 to 17 is sort of a summary of the book of Ecclesiastes. We have to include God in our plans, basically. It's God that gives our life meaning. It's God that gives our relationships meaning. And this is going to be his basic point in the entire book of Ecclesiastes. Does anybody have any comments on verses 1 through 11? Jimmy.
I'm not a King James guy at all, but I think the King James does a better job than any other translation I know of about everything is vanity. I think that
Right.
is a better, stronger word than anything else we've come up with.
Right, and that's what New American Standard uses as well. Vanity, meaningless, and then absurdity. You know, all these words are used to just try to give us different ideas of what this Hebrew word means.
That's in New American Standard?
It is.
I read it, didn't hear
It
it.
is. One guy that I saw, he was doing a presentation of it. He had a water bottle, like a spray, like a mist bottle, and every time he'd say it, he'd spray it, and it would just go. And he'd say, "Look, it's just going like mist, just like this. All this stuff is just vain and useless and meaningless." All right, we'll stop there for now, and we'll get started back in 10 minutes or so.